Have you ever heard the phrase that the sins of the father are visited on the children? Today on this week's lesson, we're going to find out what happened when a man did not learn from the sins of his father, and he ended up committing the same ones. Hello, and welcome to this week's lesson. I'm Brian Vermeer. Today we're continuing our series on the family, and we're going to be looking at the first part of the account of Joseph. And we're going to see what happened because Jacob did not learn from his father Isaac, and also a bit about Joseph not learning from his father Jacob, and the results of what can happen when children don't learn from their parents' mistakes. As parents, we often do things wrong, and we've talked about some of the things that Isaac did wrong in favoring a child over another, and even his wife favoring the other child over the first one. Today we're going to see what happened because Jacob commits that same mistake, and how Joseph makes a mistake himself because he tries to use it to his advantage. Now, before we begin, I'd like to remind you, please like, subscribe, follow the Facebook page, the YouTube page, and if you can, support me on Patreon. All right, we're in Genesis chapter 37 today. And we talked about Isaac, and we talked about how he and Rebekah had twin sons, Jacob and Esau, and how Jacob went away to find a wife. He ended up getting two wives, and each wife got a maidservant, and he ended up having children with all four of them. Altogether, he ended up having 12 sons and at least one daughter. And of these 12 sons, Jacob has a favorite son. And we're going to look at that here in Genesis chapter 37. Jacob did not learn from his father Isaac. Jacob had to leave and go to the foreign land to find a wife because he was his mother's favorite son, and his brother Esau was his father's favorite son. And because of that, the two of them were constantly at odds with each other and couldn't get along. So now we're going to see what happens because Jacob also has a favorite son. Let's start in verses 1 to 4 of Genesis chapter 37. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was the son born to him in his old age, and he made a long-sleeved robe for him. When his brothers saw their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So it says, Jacob went back to the land of Canaan, and he lived in the area where his father lived and his grandfather Abraham. And then it talks about Jacob's son Joseph. Joseph was the older son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob first fell in love with, and he worked 7 years for her, only to be tricked on his wedding night and be given her sister first. He then had to work another 7 years to get Rachel. So Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, but for a long time she couldn't have children. He had children by his first wife, Leah. He had children by Leah's handmaid, Bilhah. He had children, or by Rachel's handmaid, Bilhah. He had children by Leah's handmaid, Zilpah. And then finally, Rachel had a son, and this son was named Joseph. And because it says, number one, it was his son born to him in his old age, and also because he was the first son of Rachel, his favorite wife. That made Joseph Jacob's favorite son. And Jacob immediately commits the same sin that his father committed. He makes it obvious that he has a favorite son. And he shows favoritism. It says one of the things he did was he made a long-sleeved robe for him. Now, we often call this a coat of many colors. That's actually a mistranslation of the Hebrew word. It should actually be, it means, a coat with long sleeves is what the Hebrew actually means. But the point is, he gave Joseph nicer things. He gave Joseph presents. And the brothers saw that. And Joseph would go out of his way, apparently, to show that he was the favorite son. It also says here that Joseph was tending sheep with his brothers, and he brought a bad report back to their father. He was a snitch. He would tell on his brothers when they did things that were wrong. I remember as a teacher, I remember hearing one time, what's the difference? When does telling on someone become tattling? And when should we do it? And when should we not do it? And I remember someone telling a young child once, a child comes up and says, so-and-so is doing this or whatever. And the teacher or the person says, well, are you telling me this because you're actually afraid for him, you're afraid he could hurt himself, or something like that? Or are you just telling me this to get him in trouble? And that's the difference between, tattling and actually being concerned. There are times when we do need to tell about things that other people are doing wrong, but there are times that we're just tattling. That's not necessarily, the right thing to do then. And if we're doing it just to get somebody else in trouble, that can be a problem. And Joseph's brothers, found that as a problem. He's telling on us just to get us in trouble, just because he's dad's favorite. And because of that, the brothers hated Joseph. It says the same way that Esau hated Jacob. You would think that Jacob would learn what happened when you show favoritism to one son over the others. Jacob was almost killed by his brother because his parents showed favoritism. And yet here he is doing the same thing. And it is surprising how often we actually find things like this. How often do we find that people who abuse their children were actually abused by their parents? And we say, well, why would they do that? Certainly they know what it's like, for that to happen. The point is, this is the way you're raised. And we tend to raise our children the same way that we were raised because that's all we know. Oftentimes we do find our children doing the same things wrong that we did. But that's because that's all we knew about how to raise children. I can only raise my child the way my parents raised me, unless I make a conscious effort to do it differently. Because, that's how I was taught that children should be raised. And sometimes that's good, if you have good parents. And sometimes that's bad, because sometimes you find yourself committing the same sins that your parents did to you. And the same bad things that your parents did to you, you'll find yourself doing to your own children. So we do need to learn from our parents. We need to look at the way our parents treated us. We need to look at how our parents raised us. We need to point out what was correct, what was right, and what was wrong, what could have been done better. And then we need to make a conscious effort to do the best to raise our own children, so that our own children know right and wrong, so that our own children are able to make the right choices. Well, Jacob did not do this. Jacob showed favoritism to his young son. It says that Joseph had dreams. And in one of his dreams, he said, I dreamed that my brothers and I were all binding wheat into sheaves. And it says their sheaves bowed down before my sheaf. And again, this is a dream that God gave him, a prophecy actually. But Joseph made a point to tell his brothers about this. And that made them hate him even more because, oh, you think that you're better than we are. That's the way, they looked at it. And then he said, I had a dream where the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bowed down to me. And even Jacob heard about that one. And he said, and even Jacob gets on to Joseph about this. Do you think that one day your father, I and your mother and all your brothers are going to bow down to you? And Joseph is showing off the fact that he's the favorite. So again, the same thing here that Jacob and Esau did, that taking advantage of the fact that they are the favorites of their parents. Just because you're treated more favorably doesn't necessarily mean you need to accept it, or you certainly don't need to use it to try to gain an advantage over other people. And that's what Joseph was doing here. Well, then one day, Joseph's brothers are out tending the sheep, and Jacob sends Joseph to go out and see how they are doing. And again, they know that, when they go out and tend the sheep, Joseph may come out and see what they're doing, and if they're doing anything wrong, if they're doing anything bad, he's going to go back and tell Daddy. So let's take a look at verses 18 to 24 to see what they think about Joseph coming to check on them. It says, they saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Reuben also said to them, don't shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the long-sleeved robe that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without water. So they see Joseph coming in the distance, and the first thing they do is, hey, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. Let's rid ourselves of this problem. Let's kill Joseph. Have you ever been so angry at a sibling that you wanted to literally kill them? I hope not. I certainly hope not. I hope that none of my siblings ever actually wanted to kill me. We may make fun of each other. Oh, I'm going to kill you for doing that. But Joseph's brothers actually plotted to kill him, to get rid of this problem that they had with Joseph constantly telling on them, and of Joseph being treated like the favorite child. So they said, he's having these dreams saying that one day we're going to bow down to him. Let's kill him, and then we'll see what happens to those dreams. He thinks those dreams are a prophecy? No. If we kill him, then they can't come true. So they said, let's kill him and throw him into one of these pits. Apparently there were some dry cisterns out there. A cistern is just a big hole dug in the ground that's used for holding water. It's not a well. A well, is a big hole in the ground that reaches down to the water table, and a well is constantly filled with water from the water table. A cistern is just a big hole in the ground that you would take water from the well and pour it into the cistern, so that way you've got a large tank of water, as it were, closer to your home, so you don't have to go all the way to the well. So there was probably several of these cisterns, around where they were, and there was one there that was dry. There wasn't any water in it, so they just said, let's just kill him and throw him into one of those dry cisterns, and we can tell Dad that he was killed by a vicious animal, because there are some of them out here. There's animals out here that will kill and eat you if you don't watch yourself. So let's just do that. And then we have the oldest brother, Reuben. Reuben says, no, let's not kill him. Now, we're not sure entirely about Reuben's motives here. We like to think that Reuben took pity on Joseph and said, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into this cistern alive. But but not kill him ourselves. That way his blood won't be on our hands, and, we won't be guilty for actually killing him. It won't be us that killed him. It'll be, nature or, God that kills him, because, we just put him in there and left. Reuben could have had a couple of different motives here. First of all, he could have actually been, pitied Joseph. It says he was going to come back and eventually save him and take him back to their father. But why was he going to do that? It could be because of pity. It could be because he actually cared about Joseph and what they were doing. Or it could be because he's trying to put himself above the other brothers by being the one who rescues Joseph and brings him back, thinking maybe that'll make Dad look at me a lot better. If I go out and say, oh, I went and found your favorite son and I brought him back to you, maybe Daddy will like me better for, doing that. So we don't know what Reuben's actual motive was. Could have been good. Could have been just, plotting evil for himself, trying to, gain, favor himself. But we don't know that. The point is, because of Reuben, Joseph is not killed. They grab him. They take his coat off of him. It says, Joseph goes out to see them wearing this coat that their dad made him to show that he was the favorite son. Think about that. Joseph is not entirely without fault here. Joseph knows they don't like him wearing that coat, but he wears it to go out and see them. You might say Joseph is asking for it. If you know that there is something that is a point of contention between you and somebody else, you certainly don't flaunt it around them. You don't go out trying to make other people angry. Joseph should have done his best to try to make up with his brothers. Instead, he flaunts the very thing that makes them hate him. So Joseph is not doing anything to make the situation better. We like to look at Joseph as being the hero here, but even he has got, some problems. Again, he's taking advantage of being Dad's favorite son to have power over his brothers, which him at this time being the youngest son, it's very possible that his brother Benjamin has not been born yet. So at this time, him being the youngest, the youngest child often does that. The youngest child will often do things to try to show power over the others, and that may be what he's doing here. But it says they ripped the robe off of him and they threw him into the cistern. It does make a point to say the cistern was empty and did not have any water in it, so they're not drowning him. They're not throwing him into a pool of water. There's a interesting story in the book of Jasher, the non-biblical book of Jasher, that says that there was no water in it, but there were snakes and scorpions. And when Joseph fell down into the cistern, God caused the snakes and scorpions to go hide up against the walls so that they didn't bother him. That's not biblical. That's just a story from another different ancient book about this. So they decide, okay, we're not going to kill Joseph. So what are they going to do with him? They've got him there. What do they do now? Well, apparently while Reuben's away, maybe going to get some food, some water, something. While Reuben's away, it says some Ishmaelites, some travelers who were descendants of Ishmael. Therefore, they are, some distant cousins to the boys here. They come traveling by on their way to Egypt, and they decide, let's not just leave Joseph here because we're not going to get anything out of it for that. Let's sell him as a slave to these Ishmaelites. And then at least we can make some money. So they pull Joseph up out of the cistern, probably letting him think that they've changed their minds, they're going to rescue him, but instead he gets up and he finds that they've got this other plan. and they sell him as a slave to these Ishmaelites. And the Ishmaelites end up taking Joseph to Egypt. And we'll talk some next week about what happens to Joseph in Egypt and why this actually is all part of God's plan. But now what are they going to do? Because Jacob sent Joseph out there to check on him. Joseph's not going to come home. Reuben comes back and gets very angry because remember he had the plan that he was going to rescue Joseph and bring him home. And now that plan is foiled. So what are you going to do? Well, let's go back to what our original plan was. We'll just tell Dad that Joseph was killed by a wild beast. So let's look now at chapter 37, verses 31 to 34. It says, "So they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the robe in its blood. Then they sent the long-sleeved robe to their father and said, 'We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?' His father recognized it. 'It is my son's robe,' he said. 'A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces.' Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son many days." Something to notice there. It says, no, they killed a goat and they tore Joseph's robe up into pieces, and they dipped some of these pieces in the blood of this goat, so that way this, robe would have blood, all over it. Notice it does not say they took it to their father. Look in verse 32. It says they sent it to their father. They didn't go. They couldn't bring themselves to even take this robe to their dad and go on with this lie that they had planned. They knew what this would do to their father, and they didn't want to be there when it happened. Maybe they were afraid he would call their bluff, call them out on their trick, but I think most likely just because they didn't want to see what would become of their father when he thought his son was dead. So they don't even take it to him, they send it to him. With this note saying, "We found this out in the wilderness." Or maybe, they told the messenger to say this, "We found this out in the wilderness. We think it might belong to your son." And Jacob is devastated. His favorite son, for all he knows now, has been killed by a wild animal. Died a horrible, vicious death, being eaten by a wild animal. It says he tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist. This was what the Jews typically did for mourning. They would tear their shirt open, exposing their chest. And sackcloth was a very rough, fibrous material. And they would have some clothes made out of that they would wear when they were in time of mourning, simply because those clothes were uncomfortable and painful to wear. And he mourned for his son many days. They let their father believe that his favorite son was dead, when they knew that he wasn't. And they carry on this lie for years, because there's no way they can own up to it. And the longer it goes, the worse it gets. That's one of the problems with a lie. You let somebody believe it, and then you don't have the heart to tell them that it's a lie. Jacob believes Joseph is dead. What are they going to do? Come back and say, "Dad, by the way, Joseph isn't dead. We know that because we actually sold him off as a slave." And then the longer they go, even more they can't tell him that. So It's bad enough that they sell off their brother, but now they're letting their father just go on the rest of his life believing his favorite son has been killed. One deception leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. Well, they ought to know about deception because they learned from the best. They learned from their father. Jacob was a deceiver, and he ended up raising sons who became deceivers. We need to look at the way we've been raised. And we need to look at what was good, and we need to look at what was bad. And we need to make sure that when we raise our own children, we only give them the good. Yes, as parents, we're going to make mistakes in raising our children. But we need to use God's help to do our best to raise them so that they know God, so that they know right and wrong, and they don't end up committing the same mistakes that we did. I remember watching a TV show some time ago in which a couple with a son finds a bag of marijuana in their son's coat pocket when he comes home from school one day. And they have a discussion among themselves about whether or not they should get on to him about it. Because at that time, marijuana was still illegal all over America. And by the way, in case you don't know, there is still a federal law that says marijuana is illegal all across the country, but nobody's enforcing it. But they have this discussion among themselves about whether or not they should get on to him about having it, because they said, both of them said, when we were in college, we tried marijuana. So can we really punish him for it? Can we really, tell him not to do it? And my answer to that is, yes, you can. If you find your child committing the same mistakes that you made, yes, you can get on to them about it. You can correct them about it, even if you did the same thing, because hopefully you learned it was wrong. If my daughter ends up doing some of the things that I did that I know were wrong, yes, it's my job to correct her, even if I did the same things. No, I'm not a hypocrite for doing that. I learned they were wrong, and I want to save her that trouble. That's what a good parent does. So next week we're going to see what happened to Joseph when he got to Egypt. We're going to find out this was actually all part of God's plan, but even that does not excuse what the brothers did. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next week.